Hello world. Yeah, you're gonna start with that.
Exactly. We're here. We're making this happen. My name is Mohammed. Last name is Naser. Soon it will start showing up somewhere in this project. Um,
We lost you, Alex.
yeah, Alex, you still with us?
Sorry about that. My laptop battery just crashed, even though it was plugged in. So I think that doesn't augur well for the future of that computer. But I switched.
Oh, too bad, Alex, because I shared all
He
my
took it personally, and he was telling us some deep dark secrets and
deep stuff. So
yeah.
it's your turn, Alex. How are you?
It was basically through Sophia Vinogradov that I got turned on to psychiatry, who was working with my PhD advisor to use MEG to study the neural networks involved in schizophrenia and trying to understand something about what's different about the brains of people who have schizophrenia and how might those networks actually be flexibly modulated through cognitive training to improve as a therapeutic approach to schizophrenia. I'd actually thought I was going to become a neurosurgeon.
I went to medical school thinking I was going to do psychiatry. I realized that my interest in psychiatry was not going to be fulfilled by doing psychiatry. And everything I wanted to do could be done or could only be done with neurosurgery. And it was because I met Bob Buchanan. I met him and I learned about the stuff he was doing, which was basically invasive epilepsy monitoring with electrodes and doing these experiments and looking at at the time he was looking at grid cells in the entorhinal cortex, and these are the cells that help us navigate through space in a room. Like when you walk into a room, there's these cells, and every time you walk to a certain part of the room, they fire and tell your brain where you are in that room. And if you go into a new room, they fire in a way that tells you where you are in that room. And so these cells were found in rats and then in humans, and they were doing a lot of this work at this hospital in Austin. And he spent the whole time telling me that I should be a psychiatrist, and it was a huge waste of my time to be a neurosurgeon. So it was a very complicated way to get here. But when I met Aviva on the trail, all of a sudden Minnesota jumped out of nowhere and became my top choice. And I did my training here, and then got super excited. Had to sort of figure stuff out on my own for a few years, but learned a lot. And then thankfully Alex came along when Sophia was like, I need you to talk to this guy and I need you to get him here.
Sophia put me in touch with David. She said, I think there's someone that you really would, enjoy talking to. He is, amazingly very similar interests to you, even though he's coming from the neurosurgery side. And she knew that I'd started to work with neurosurgeons at UCSF doing work with neurosurgical patients and recording directly from the brain, which I saw as sort of like the next logical step towards getting better quality data to look at the kinds of questions that I was interested in, data that's better and much more powerful than the data we can get from non-invasive methods. And I remember actually standing outside my house, David, in San Francisco, talking to you on the phone that night. It was probably like March or something.
Yeah, because I was driving by Lake Makaska.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I remember it. Yeah, I remember I was just driving by the lake talking to you on the phone in the car. We were talking about some Granger approaches towards something, or
yeah, connectivity.
Yeah.
And it was just such a fluid, seamless conversation, and
that's not the David that I know. You have fluid, seamless conversations with him?
Yeah, it's been eerie. I think Alex and I are pretty much lockstep without intending to be, and I think our interests and our thought processes and just everything lined up so well that I got really excited, and I was like, this is going to be impossible for this to work out. We come into this wanting to cure all these diseases, and so we sit down and so we start off and we're like, what are these diseases, and where do we even start here? Everything is nothing and nothing is everything. And then we just kind of start with axiomatic logic. Our lab is complicated. Now we'll just start with that. It's complicated because we're trying to do something different. We're trying to do something different, and that's made it really complicated.
What are you trying to do?
I'll let Alex take this one.
I think, so that we're trying to do something different. There are multiple aspects of what we're trying to do that's different, right? One, on a practical level, we're trying to have a 2-PI, co-PI lab and run it together. And that's not the conventional model at all. And it comes with lots of advantages as well as lots of challenges, right? And the system isn't really set up to support that. Although I would say the university has done an amazing job of supporting us, and it helps that we're in different departments, I think, so that we can essentially take our support from each department and put it together. But in general, labs are typically set up pretty hierarchically with one PI at the top. And so that's one aspect of what we're doing that's different. And I think another is, trying to combine psychiatry with neurosurgery, which isn't unprecedented by any means. Like what David was saying, there are people have done this in the past, and there are people trying to do this now. But it is still, it's still, I would say, like bleeding edge in terms compared to what a traditional approach would be to trying to do research in neurosurgery or psychiatry, for that matter, or neuroscience. And then, the third, I guess I would say, is combining engineering with experimental work, and then focusing on questions that are pretty abstract and high level, like decision making, mood, as opposed to, sensory processing, or something that is much, lower level and intractable in a sense. And so, like David said, when you start to approach a question like, how do changes in mood affect, the decisions that someone makes, immediately you're talking about sort of like every part of the brain that we know of somehow being involved. And so then the question is like, how do you get purchase on that? Like, what is the angle that enables you to actually ask a well-defined question with a falsifiable hypothesis and have a method that allows you to, test that hypothesis? So there's a lot that makes what we're trying to do complicated.
And being clinically relevant.
Right.
I think that's the one thing about our lab there's so much tension in general in labs that are trying to answer abstract questions like about decision making or something that abstract, and at the same time come up with treatments for diseases that Alex and I see in the clinic. That is something that really, I think, in many ways exists wholeheartedly in sort of the electrophysiology neuromodulation world. Because while we're recording, we can test things where we stimulate and see what it does to the things that we're recording. Right. So, and then we can tie that to behavior or disease and then figure out if we're helping or hurting people.
Are you doing this with a concise, big picture understanding of where you want to take this work, or are you doing this in real time as you observe and find stuff and you say, this is cool, let's explore this further? How much of what your work is in the moment based on the clinical work you're doing versus having a sense of strategic direction as to where this work is going?
Yeah, that's a complicated question because there's a lot of learning that we do in the lab as we go, and there are certain things that are essentially not possible. I think we're, in a sense, because we're a 2-PI lab, we have a little bit of freedom to do that,
I mean, the way I think about it, and this is sort of how I got interested in psychiatry, is, no matter what medical condition someone has, their quality of life is ultimately heavily influenced, if not determined by their mental state, right? And so it's the effects on the brain of whatever you're experiencing that ultimately determine how much suffering there is, right? I mean, that's boiling it down, but it's very simplistic. And then you see this, and that's not just at a philosophical level, but at a very real level, even with patients with what we consider to be, straight neurological disorders like Parkinson's disease, where what they tend to tell you really matters the most to them are not necessarily the things we associate with Parkinson's disease, like a tremor or difficulty walking, but the problems they have, paying their bills or their inability to go back to work, their difficulty carrying on a conversation, these things that tend to reflect more the cognitive aspects going on. And so that cognitive aspect becomes then a unifying theme where you realize that there are so many disorders where if we could actually improve the pieces that involve cognition in that disorder, we can make a really big impact on someone's quality of life. And that could be in Parkinson's disease, it could be in depression, it could be in chronic pain, it could be in addiction, right? And so I think in terms of like the long-term picture, we're both interested in ultimately developing devices that can improve the way people's cognitive processes work in these disorders. And so, for instance, how that affects their ability to plan, how that affects their ability to have relationships, how that affects their ability to think about the future, how that affects their ability to even be able to work. And so that, I think, at least, the way I think about it is kind of like the guiding motivation that this is an area that we could make an impact on so many different disorders potentially, where there are common unifying themes like what's the neural basis for motivated behavior? What's the neural basis for making decisions under uncertainty? And because these are things that are directly impacted by these different disorders that some of which should be thought of as being classically psychiatric and others as neurological or neurosurgical. And so when I think about like, where do we want to be in 10 years? Like, we want to have clinical trials going on devices that are operating on some biological signal that we've discovered that is essentially derived from something that is transdiagnostic, that cuts across these different disorders, that somehow links, explains why people with these different conditions all have trouble making decisions or doing kind of basic cognitive work. So the idea is like, maybe if we can study core cognitive processes and how they're, can be modulated by neuromodulation, then that can lead to, direct approaches to, improving people's lives in clinical care in a variety of areas. So I don't know, that's like...
That's really cool to hear. Do you both feel that what you're doing is part of a larger trend that is emerging in the field? Are you part of a larger effort that has taken this approach to problem solving, or is anything you're doing different than where the status quo of the field is at and how lab work is being done?
That's somewhat hard to answer because what we're working on cuts a lot of lines, I think. So we could find examples of people doing, similar work. I don't, there's very few places that can put that together with the clinical side and can take it from the psychiatric clinic back to the neurosurgery clinic and to the neurology clinic. And I think being able to do that all at once is where our strength is. And I think this, the transdiagnostic approach that Alex is talking about really comes from an underlying belief of ours that there is significant overlap in the circuits of cognition that are affected sort of differentially by a lot of these diseases. And I think there's, you know, significant evidence for that. And there's sort of all the way from sort of evolutionary embryological evidence to a long history of neurologic diseases that have sort of revealed that slowly over time that there is some foci of the brain that have preserved and relatively specific function that interact with the rest of the brain in sort of a circuit, right? And it's hard to phrase in a way that is completely true all the time. It's not so specific that parts of the brain are really operating in isolation, but we know that there are sort of general trends in how the brain is organized. And this circuit-based approach, I think, is something that our peers are taking. You know, this is the direction and a belief across society amongst our friends and colleagues that, you know, this is how the brain works. It works in a circuit. But in many ways, how to tackle that circuit, I think, is what's exciting right now.
Okay.
You know, how would you tackle a very recurrent and complex web of interactions and make any sense of it? And there's some really cool experiments people have done to take another sort of look at this and see, like, how are we ever going to be successful at this? It's very complicated. You know, recently, maybe like a couple of years ago, there was a group that essentially took a microprocessor and they applied all of the neuroscientific approaches that we take to the microprocessor like they would on a brain. You know, a microprocessor, we know how it works. We made it, right? And they applied all these techniques, all the things, you know, some of the things that Alex and I employ in the lab, some analyses, like, you know, you stimulate here, what happens over here, you know, some very simple things. And at the end of the day, after applying all of these things, they came up with all these conclusions that were all wrong. And they couldn't figure it out, you know, from basic principles. And I think, you know, there's a lot of problems with that study in the sense that it's, you know, but it makes a point that, you know, we are all very biological and very limited brains trying to figure out the brain with these, like, you know, catastrophically terrible tools. And they're getting better over time for sure.
Right.
And there are super smart people coming up with crazy ways to approach the brain. But we have to, you know, realize, you know, we're still, you know, we are still limited in many, many ways, you know, and that's something that's really cool that our lab can sort of talk about, you know.
Yeah.
And I would add to that, you know, obviously we're not pulling things out of thin air. Like we're inspired and motivated, and, you know, we draw from mentors and from ideas that are out there. I think one thing that is particularly innovative about what we're doing is just how closely we dialogue about what's possible from a neurosurgical perspective and what's relevant to psychiatry, and how that connects with what's possible from a computational perspective and from a neuroscientific perspective. And so, you know, psychiatrists and neurosurgeons have collaborated together in the past, obviously, but those are not always the easiest collaborations to have, in the sense that people are coming from such different perspectives. They don't necessarily have a lot of time together, whereas, like, we're working this out every day, like, you know, in terms of what's actually possible, technically speaking, neurosurgically, and then what's relevant to the patients that we both see, or that, you know, that David might see in clinic, or that I might see in clinic. And so I think that, you know, that level of feedback, the feedback loop is just so much tighter in our case. I think, ultimately what the products that we'll realize are going to be potentially a lot more powerful and even relevant, because that feedback isn't happening on the long time scales that it might in other situations. I don't know if that makes sense, but
it does. It's really, as a complete outsider, it's just really cool hearing your specialties merging into this lab work to problem solve the way you're doing. It's actually making me wonder if you were to bring a third PI from a third field to work on this as a 5 to 10 year plan, like who else would you bring to this work? Is it someone from engineering, someone from a PhD in higher education? Like what emerging can you do?
PhD in higher education. So
you know what, that's a good point. I think the real distillation of that comment is one of the other things that's really cool about our lab is, in many ways, we are very, very closely associated with a lot of other labs on campus.
Yeah.
So I would say, we have almost a surrogate, family around us that's tighter than usual.
Okay.
We have actually quite a few engineers that are around us and neuroscientists that are around us that support us and are at arms, they are very close. At any time, if we need help, we are free to reach out to them. And there's some, we want to be successful. And the old model is that we have to be successful individually. And the newer model is we have to be successful together.
Right.
And I think the newest model is that we have to be successful as a community.
Right.
And that's very hard to reward through sort of the normal academic path. But one thing I will say about our situation is that we like a lot of the people that are around us right now. It's actually almost distracting how much we like interacting with the people around us, because they're all so very smart and they all bring something different to the table. And it's I was describing this earlier today. It's almost like, we get into a room with too many of these people and it's like a frenzy. We just can't hold it in. It's so exciting right now because everybody is so excited about making progress. And Alex and I are in this position where, as the clinicians, we are a surgeon and a clinician. We provide access to patients, and we also provide the patients with access to super smart researchers, right, to try to figure this stuff out. And a big part of our job is figuring out how to safely conduct science and clinical research simultaneously so that there is symbiosis that is synergistic.
And I think that actually gets to another part of your earlier question, Mohammed, which is like, is this all a long-term plan, or are you doing this moment to moment in real time? Because taking advantage of the strength of that community, I think, is actually, it really plays out in real time, where we have these big, ambitious, lofty goals, but how you actually pick very specific, concrete things to work on, in our case, has been heavily influenced by our interactions with the people around us, right? So, like, we might have some goal, like we know decision-making is impaired in pain, it's impaired in addiction, it's impaired in depression. Well, it turns out that, one of our collaborators, Ben Hayden, has a particular neuroscientific finding about decision-making that we can then test in our patients. Or that Alec Widge, who's another one of our collaborators, has developed this really cool method for controlling, for doing neural oscillation lock stimulation, that we think like, oh, this is something we could directly work with him to actually implement one of our ideas for modulating circuits underlying decision making. So something like that, I think that community and those day-to-day interactions are what actually shape the the details of the particular projects and how we're getting towards these long-term goals that we set out for ourselves.
Cool. You're helping me kind of zoom out a little bit and situate your lab work in the large context. And that's why I was asking about the trends in general that you're seeing in the field and the kind of collaborations you're having. So it's very helpful as an introduction to your work. It's just, at least for me, to understand some of the context within which you're functioning. I think if I have one remaining question to that is on the other side of things. So you're talking about the collaborations and the community of researchers and support that you're enjoying within the university system. Facing any pockets of resistance, any pushback, any doubters that say, "What are you doing?" Or do you feel like the road is kind of a little bit paved for you to try out these ideas and see where you can go with them? Any resistance?
I don't feel like we've hit a lot of resistance.
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think if anything, everybody's very supportive, and it's sort of like, it's sort of like you've walked with your friend halfway home, and he lives in the bad part of town, and you have no idea what's going to happen to this guy, but you're like, best of luck to you. I have nothing but love and support. And then Alex and I are starting to walk down, the rest of the way, because there's a lot of treachery, and Alex and I worry endlessly about so many things, because, the last thing we want to do is hurt anyone. And so we take great, we go to extreme lengths to make sure things are safe, tested, effective, everything possible that we could do, which, certainly pays off. But the only thing that we want to do is to dramatically improve the quality of life of many of our patients. I mean, that is everything to our lab. And so that responsibility, beyond just making sure that we are as safe as possible, that responsibility also weighs, just so heavily on me, and I know Alex, because there is a somewhat of a measurable progress. It's not papers. I mean, papers are something, but there is we are an interdisciplinary lab, and we are a surgeon clinician science lab. We can see the direct results. We know what results our work has on this. So if it does not have a good effect, we will know, and we'll hear about it from our colleagues on the medical side.
Yeah. That's really cool.
Yeah. So I think what David's trying to say is no one's put up resistance to us, but we ourselves are, concerned about, we don't want to take a step too far, right? We want to walk each step by step, get to where we're going, because, at least on the invasive side of what we're doing, the potential consequences are really serious. And we just want to make sure we're doing that right, which is, I think, is one reason why, we're not just interested in a black box brain machine interface approach to neural devices, which is certainly it's critical to have that kind of technology and that capability. But I think also understanding what is actually happening in the brain and how that was related to the symptoms and conditions that we're interested in is critical ultimately to doing something that helps people and doesn't harm people. So I think that was a little bit of a leap there, but it's something else that was like spinning around in my head that, I was just thinking about like this, when Elon Musk did his presentation recently, and some of the Twitter chatter about that was like, two sides arguing like whether or not this is like the most incredible thing that they've ever seen, or this is sort of irrelevant because no one has any idea why any of what they're doing is working. And I don't see it as being like strictly dichotomous that way. I do think you need both arms, right? You need like the engineering to be able to actually make these things work, but then you need the understanding to know what you're doing and what and
why you're doing it.
Why you're doing it, sure.
Right.
And we really bring all of that together.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
I think you still need that third PI from higher education, based on what I heard. Something is missing from your work.
No, we have you. You're right here.
Right.
Oh, okay. I'm in. Sign me up.